excited to 2025. And I'm really excited to present Melissa Joseph and Julia Norton in our two-person show called Pulp Memories, which is this very show. So it's nice to have the talk in here because they can point out the works to you, and we'll learn a lot during this hour. Just a little housekeeping. Once we're done, the public reception will start. So we're gonna maybe have some Q&A depending on how much we get through. But a little before 5, we're gonna wrap up. And then if you can put your chairs together by folding them, my team, which is Shemaya there, and Jaina and Matilda are back there. They will help take the chairs away, and then we'll have the reception from 5 to 7. But I'm just going to really briefly introduce them, and I think maybe have one sentence at this point, because we'll learn a lot more. But Melissa is a New York-based artist, and her work considers themes of memory, family history, and the politics of how we occupy spaces. Her work has been shown at the Norton Museum, ICA San Francisco, Liz Gallery at Swarthmore, and many more. Julia Norton is a multimedia artist, educator, and researcher with a primary focus on natural materials. Her work has been exhibited at the Samuel Dorsey Museum of Art, the Deitch Projects, and many more. And we're happy to have her back in Boston. She got her master's at Harvard, so knows this part of the world quite well. And so we're going to talk a lot about them and this particular selection of work. And I'll start with, actually, whoever wants to start, but I wanted to talk about the material of paper and why the two of you are working on paper for this particular show. Maybe we start with you, Melissa, since you're on that far end, and you can tell us, because this is specific, the way that you came about making this body work.
Yeah, so the works that are, you can tell that there's two different artists here, I think pretty clearly. My work is in frames, and Julia's are like mounted and more 3D. So the works that are here, I made at a residency in New York called Dieu Donné, and they invite artists to come in and do a residency and learn about paper making, knowing that most of the artists that come in haven't worked with paper before. Because even though it's such an ancient way of making, it's not that easy to do intuitively. You kind of need someone to show you how to do it anyway. And so yeah, the works were all made during that residency. It's a process called pulp painting, which is not unlike the work that I usually make with felt, which is another fiber-based way of making. But it's very fast and urgent because it's all happening wet on wet processes. So they make a piece of paper with abaca fibers, which are plant fibers that are beaten in a giant, almost KitchenAid mixer type machine. And they, make these sheets of wet paper, and then they give you wet paper pulp that's been tinted to different colors using pigments, and you're sort of squeezing them like with ketchup, not sort of, they really are like ketchup and mustard bottles that have been put like cake icing tips on the end so that you can control the speed that the liquid is coming out. But the liquid that's coming out is actually paper pulp. So it's this interesting thing that lets you have once it dries, even though it was wet when it went down, it stays and becomes paper, so the edges become really interesting in these works. And I won't go too much more into it because otherwise we'll run out of time.
Actually, can you just tell us why working in this material was a bit of a departure for you?
Oh yeah, thank you. It was a departure. I am kind of known in the art space for felting, but I only started doing that during the pandemic. I consider myself a material-based artist. I like all materials, but I usually say I like dry mess over wet mess. This is one exception. But because this residency exists, and I saw a way that I could maybe try to translate my visual language from one material into another, which is something that's I'm interested in doing. It was really attractive to try to do that. So I applied a couple years in a row. I finally got to do it. And yeah, it's interesting because you have to make decisions when you don't know a material well that you don't have to make in a material that you know really well. It's like if you're speaking a language you don't know that well and you're just trying to like put together sentences very basic, but if you get the point across, then you did what you were trying to do, sort of. That's what it feels like when you start a new material, and that was really what drew me over to the project.
Thank you. All right, Julia.
Yeah.
You have a deep relationship with paper making.
Well, yes and no. It's sort of a difficult question for me to answer in some ways because is this mic okay?
Yeah, you sound good. Actually, I think Melissa can be a little louder,
Okay.
but Julia, I think you're good.
I'm good. Okay, cool. It's always weird to hear your voice echoed in the space. I have kind of a new relationship with paper in some ways. I mean, my practice is very material based, and I just love learning about all kinds of different materials, especially the history of materials. And so paper has always been a little bit kind of on the back burner for me for a long time, but something I knew that once I started getting into it, it was going to be a rabbit hole and take over my life. So I was kind of waiting. But what Melissa says is really interesting. I think the work you're seeing here is a process and a style of making that I've only really started about a couple years ago. And it was because of paper why I started making these more kind of three-dimensional pieces. Before I was doing watercolor paintings on paper using natural pigments and historical pigments, which is also part of my education work, which is why I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but that's another story. And it's what brought me to Boston. But I started working with paper because I did a residency in Oaxaca in Mexico. And while I was there, I went there mainly for research and not so much to make. There wasn't like a making residency. Some residencies you go to like make a body of work and spend time, have like unrestricted time to make work. And in this case, it was there mostly for research. A lot of my interest in materials, a lot of materials that I'm interested in come from that region. And it wasn't until maybe like the last little quarter of the residency that I met this paper maker. His name is Alberto Valenzuela. He lives in Etla in Oaxaca, and he is a former molecular biologist who became a paper maker much later in life. And when I met him, he told me, he sort of spent like this whole hour telling me about the history of paper, its origins in China, and how it migrated over the world, and it just basically blew my mind with this history. But the thing that really it made me so just attracted to the way he talked about paper is he talked about it like a molecular structure, like a strand of DNA. Because paper, it has a fabric-like quality to it, but there's no warp and weft. It doesn't have a binary relationship. It's also, so it's like many, many little particles, but it's also not a pigment. It's bound together. It has this marriage of materials. And it's very fragile. It can disintegrate, it can tear. And so it's just this really incredible material that has, this like multi-level structure that binds it together with these materials like abaca or like cotton. In his case, he uses ixle, which is it's agave fiber. And he also uses like bananas and all these other things. So I guess that's a long-winded way of me saying that my paper obsession has kind of just begun in a way, and I'm now fully in it.
Thank you. I think we'll touch on this later, but the two of you also have backgrounds as art educators, and I think it really shows in the way you talk about the work and about the process too. But I want to ask about process, because I think you can go about making art with paper in so many different ways. So Melissa, when you went into Dieu Donné for the residency, did you know that this was how you were going to approach it? Did you know that this would be the outcome? I would love to understand your process as you were going into that residency.
Sure. When they invite you in, they kind of take you through the archive and show you a lot of the other artists that have worked through, over the years in the space and what they've done. It really is incredible how versatile it is as a material. You can cast it, so people do sculptural things with it. And I remember being really taken by, Anne Hamilton had done a project where she cast her fists and then with wax, and then they wrapped these linen or flax sort of sheets around it as a laminate cast. So I wanted to try that. So in the beginning I was trying all kinds of things, and then they do an orientation where they show you, they let you experiment, because you don't know what you don't know yet. And then everybody kind of tends to gravitate towards some part of paper making over the course of the residency. And I was immediately taken with the pulp painting. They said you know, it's funny, you never know who is gonna gravitate for what, but.
Is there an example from one of these pieces where you can talk about a little, just briefly about that process?
Yeah, you know, like the smaller works were works I was doing for the most part when I was learning how the fibers work. So something that's kind of cool that happens in it, because it's wet, if you take two of the different pigments, they don't dry kind of at the same rate, and the suspension of the pigment isn't the same because of the chemicals that are in the pigment. So in some of them there's like a bleed. If you look around, I think on that one with the dancers, the ballet dancer, there you can sort of see like a halo sometimes on the, like on the girl in the purple. That's my niece Olive with the striped pants, not wearing at all the ballet outfit you're supposed to wear, and then her best friend Fiona, who's like the perfect ballerina. So around Fiona's head is kind of like this halo of brown, but that wasn't intentional. That's just the way that the pigment sort of bled out from the brown into the clear agatha. And so then as you start to get to know that, you can start to control it. So by the time I got to the bigger pieces, I could allow for some almost like marbling to happen by layering wet pigments on top of each other, wet pulps on top of one another. So it's you learn through, the material teaches you, which I think you feel the same way. Like if you're a material person, you learn from the material itself.
And Julia, for you, I mean, we did a studio visit in 2021, I think, and you were not making this work at all. And then when I saw you share images of this work, I was really excited because it just showed, I mean, first of all, these are sculptural, essentially. You know, the work I had seen in your studio before were paper paintings or, you know, with your handmade pigments. But yeah, I mean, can you talk us and walk us through how you came about this, you know, this three-dimensionality and the structure?
Well, it's so interesting because I was just reminded like how we met, and we met sort of through like natural pigment ink makers, but also like other people here in Boston. And so I was thinking through like our relationship and that studio visit in particular. And I think, you know, I think the pandemic has a lot to do with it because I think my practice really shifted very slowly after the pandemic, where I, you know, was making really small works and then kind of getting my feet, you know, feeling stabilized again in the studio. And I think I needed to do that. But then when I started making this work, which was, it seems pretty divergent, I kind of felt like it was there all along. And I just like needed to give myself permission to do it, which I think is true for a lot of artists, where you sort of reach a point in your life and your career where you just are like, you know what? I don't have to do the same thing I've always done. Like, why does anyone feel like they need to do that? Doesn't matter how old you are. It's what I tell my students, so why am I not taking that advice? I've always collected objects. I've always had a very close relationship with like things that I find and things that I forage for. So I have a studio that's just like full of stuff that was just waiting for me to use it, and it was just sitting there. And so then, yeah, then I just started kind of making these pieces, and a lot of them became sculptural because my studio mate, John Spaza, was making these sculptural pieces, and I started taking his offcuts and just wrapping them in paper. And there was something kind of, and like, Melissa and I talked about this a little bit too, there's a lot of care in working with paper, and something about wrapping those objects felt like such an act of like tenderness and care. And I say this in the statement a little bit, and I'm still working some of these thoughts through, just about those sorts of implications that come into artwork and that meaning. When you're making something, it's not only vulnerable because you're putting your thoughts and emotions and feelings into visual space, but you're using your hands in the same way you would if you're wrapping paper around an object or putting a child to bed or getting them dressed, or, you know, these things that you do. And so, yeah, I don't know, I went on a tangent, but I guess this new work really did feel like it was always in me, and now that I've given myself permission to really go with it, it feels very freeing and exciting. And I'm just very happy and thankful that you have asked me to do this with someone like Melissa, who I admire so much.
Oh my God, both of you are superstars. Yeah, no, I'm so excited to have you both here. I want to talk about the story and narrative components of your practices, but I think this is a segue. That when you talk about care, and I mean, it's so labor intensive, right? Both of these types of practices that we're showing here. How does that, I mean, are you just exhausted at the end of the process? You know, because I've heard from you, Melissa, when you talk about the wet studio, it seems like a lot to deal with, and a lot of kind of variables, really, you know, because you probably have work that like you can't really control it as well as you might have if it was one of your felt paintings, you know, or
I think, yeah, for sure. I think I definitely can the felt, you know, you can start and stop whenever you want. Because of the nature of Dieu Donné, the space, there's so much demand for access to that place because they have a wet studio that most people don't have in their homes or in their own studios. And they have the expertise of the master paper makers there. So you only get, you know, a day here, a day there. I might only get 16 hours in a whole year, and they're concentrated like as 2 8-hour days. So I know I have only 8 hours to do this, and if I don't get it done, I don't get to do it. So that's like a weird amount of pressure, but also, I don't know, somehow as an artist, you can kind of sometimes have some freedom about the way your day goes. You can make something, you can take a break and have a phone call or have a lunch, and there you're on your feet for 8 hours working. It is really physically exhausting by the end, and then emotionally exhausting because I don't know, some people are really decisive people. I heard they're happier. I'm not, and so having to like make so many decisions rapid fire over and over again because you just are making decisions. You just have to make them, even whether you're equipped to make them or not. You have to make them, and so I think like that also becomes emotionally exhausting too. But it's, you know, it's also exhilarating and fun, and you feel like you did something. And if you really mess it up, I mean, like on a sheet like that, like a 40 by 60 sheet, it would be a real bummer because I'm not going to ever get another 40, 60 by sheet. But on like an 11 by 14, I could make one of those by myself. So,
just because in order to even make that paper, you needed the assistance of so many of the paper masters.
You need a lot of people to make a sheet of paper like that. So, well, people that know what they're doing, right, for sure. So they're like the people at the residency aren't willing to make them very often. So I have to kind of negotiate that, which is like another exhausting thing to do. But yeah, so I would say definitely there is an exhaustion, but it's also, I wouldn't have it any other way because like there's so much stuff going on in the world that we can't control. So to make your studio practice one that is centering kind of empathy and care is like a thing that you can do. There's a lot of things that we can't do. So I think like at least it's like in our immediate vicinity, we can do small things that are, you know, enacting care, even if it's on an object or like it's tending to material that has an ecological past, right? You know, there's a story there too. So.
Yeah, I think that's so well put, and I think, you know, studio time is so precious, and especially both of us are New York-based artists, and it's hard to make time and space for that. I used to live very close to my studio, and now I don't, so, which is actually better, because when I go to my studio, I have to plan to be there the whole day and really spend the time. Versus before I could be like, oh, I'll go to the studio for a couple hours, I'll go home for lunch, and then I'll never go back. So it's like a real time commitment, but that's also helped me in some ways because it's, you know, I really just like give it my all, and then usually at the end of the day I'm exhausted. And I think that's such a necessary thing to have as an artist, and even to give yourself like emotional space because you might mess something up and feel bummed about it, and then you just have to sort of reckon with those emotions. And it's hard sometimes to do social things after because you're kind of going through that process. But I think for me too, it's interesting what Melissa was saying about the bigger works because some of the materials and the objects I work with, I only have one. And I mentioned I'm very much connected to objects and materials, and I think that's part of being human. And so there's a certain amount of responsibility. I mean, I only have so much paper that I got from Oaxaca, and so I have to be really particular about when I use it, what I use it for. Of course, I make mistakes, and some things don't make it, but it's still, you do need a lot of energy, mental energy to make those decisions, in addition to physical energy.
Thank you. Let's talk about subject matter, stories, how you both have pulled stories as a narrative through line in both bodies of work. I guess Melissa, we'll start with you. All of your drawings or paintings here are based on old family photographs, for the most part.
For the most part, they're moving into contemporary time too. Actually, there's one not in the show, but in this body of work, that's your brother.
Nice.
But they're either people that are in my life currently or from my ancestors. And I think Yeah, you know, we're way more alike than we are different, even though it doesn't feel that way sometimes. And I think that's like, there are these kind of universal elements that I think I'm trying to, when I'm sifting through imagery, whether it's from the past or from now, I think I'm trying to identify subconsciously sometimes things that I think are relatable to people outside, even if it's a very specific image and the people, I know who they are, that people hopefully don't need to know who they are to have a connection or to like have it trigger some kind of memory. So it's about connecting kind of on that level, but then on the bigger level, allowing for the stories of the actual people to also exist. You know, like being South Asian, you know, there wasn't a lot of contemporary South Asian art for me to look at growing up. That's changing. I'm really grateful for it. There wasn't a lot of imagery that looked like the family that I was living in. And I think that's like biracial families or just mixed families in general. But I know families look all kinds of ways and always have, but we just haven't seen it. So it's important for me to kind of put that imagery out there, just to live, just to be one more possibility. And then having them be accepted into spaces like this or educational spaces or institutional spaces is just a way for them like to have more people be able to see them. So my niece, I say I make a lot of work for my niece specifically so that she can go and literally see herself in these spaces.
Yeah, and your work is also about stories, but a little different.
Yeah, it's different, yes, well, yes and no, because I think it's, I don't know, trying to think how to phrase this in the context of storytelling. I mean, I think like all good art should tell some sort of story, even if that happens, like, it should happen for each individual in a different way. I mean, I think for me, because again, like I am so connected to materials, and I think each material has a life, whether that's, you know, the beginning of time or like the past few years.
You have meteorite.
I have meteorites. Yes, some of these pieces have actual materials from outer space in them, and so those tell their own stories, and so that's important. And I think for me, a lot of the imagery too, it's like setting the stage for a story too, because I think right now especially I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between the body and the land. So landscapes, I mean, some of these works you can see landscapes that are either kind of mimicking, you know, hills or suns or tunnels or.
Can we talk about this piece here?
Yeah.
Excavation? I think that's
sure.
Really big. This is the large piece on this wall.
Yeah, I think, well, so that piece, gosh, yeah, so that's the biggest piece I've ever made in my life. It took 5 months. A lot of that was because I was learning different processes as I was making them. I mean, I was also balancing the, you know, museum education profession at the same time. But that was like a real like learning piece, because I was really trying to, you know, use every new technique that I had to create something. This piece has a lot of different layers to it. It's titled Excavation, because that is also a title of a painting famous painting by Monde, which was the first time I'd ever seen a painting where I could get a sense of myself looking at it from a bird's eye view, and I kind of had that different orientation, or that, I don't know, like the different way of seeing something that's on a wall. So I kind of took that title a little bit literally in a certain way, because there are these kind of like holes and pockets, and then there is this sort of river channel. But in addition to that, I mean, I think a lot about the body. I have a few different kind of chronic health conditions, a lot of them, you know, epilepsy, and some of which are neurological. And so I think those shapes and that sense of this connection to the land, and also what's inside of us, came into that too. So yeah, I don't know. And then there's all different sorts of significance with the materials. Those little black objects are called devil seed pods. It's kind of an invasive watercress plant, I believe. And I liked that they had this sort of alien-like quality to them. They're in some of the other pieces as well. But yeah, there was something like, there's something kind of supernatural about them that I liked. And I also put like kind of cross shape that's also in the opossum bone vertebrae that's in the center of that circle.
And can you talk about the road where the fiber and the way that's
Yeah.
the way that you, first of all, when we were installing it, you were saying, this is how I like it, but whoever has it can do it the way that they might like.
Totally. Yeah, that's how I had it in my studio, but I've also had it in different ways. I've had it kind of like sort of spiraling on the floor. I've asked like people in studio visits, like, how would you do this? Or like, you know, hold it, see how it feels to move this around. So there, yeah, and then also all those pieces, like, it basically putting it together in the gallery, it's like a whole puzzle situation. But yeah, and that's made from like sheep roving, or actually, no, it is sheep, it's not alpaca. And then there's a rope, and then I tied yarn around it, that's naturally dyed yarn. And yeah, I mean, I think like different people have said that it reminds them of different things, but I think sometimes I like to just say the work has like the landscape body connection, sort of let people take that what they want. I feel like there's parallels, you know, that I see, but so I don't know.
I mean, I often think of like the story of Earth is the story of our bodies.
Yeah.
You know, we're connected no matter how we tell that story. I had really wanted to install built-ins, this large piece next to this one, because when we started putting the show together, I realized that, oh my God, this format-wise and the lines, they actually look like they should belong together. But Melissa, I mean, for this piece, built-ins, you know, there is somebody that appears to be on the television, for example, but it's not, you know, your niece, it's not a family member. I'm really curious to understand the story behind this piece, and you know, the one thing I can make out really clearly is the book that says India. So can you tell us about this?
Yeah, sure. This piece is in the house that I grew up in, which burned down when I was in like my maybe early 30s. My parents lived in rural Pennsylvania, so that's where I grew up. And it was a house that like somebody made, like everything. I've been going through photos and like I can kind of see now like the kitchen cabinets were just like stained plywood, and like that's just the way it was just built, like to be functional. And so someone made these sort of built-in cabinets in the downstairs, because my parents bought it from another family when they moved to town, and it became our playroom, I guess. That's what we called it. So those cabinets underneath were just like jam-packed full of random toys and crap. But later they came to house, like when we grew up and the toys were gone, they became where we kept all the family photos. So like that space is really important to me, and since it's gone, like it's even more sort of, it's like a mythical space a little bit.
So this was made from memory?
No, so this is from, so the weird thing about, luckily my mom was one of 8, and my dad, or one of 9, and my dad was one of 8. So even though for all the photos that we lost in the fire, there were other photos, like from like a little bit different angle, right? Or like from like another person's, with another main character. So we had other photos, like I've been able to like put together, I don't have a ton, I definitely don't have the ones that like, it's weird to talk about the fire now in like the context of these other fires, because, you know, obviously everybody was okay and we're really grateful, and to not have the photos is like the least of the thing. But the photos that did manage to make it out of this fire are like the ones you would not have grabbed if you were running around. They were like weird ones of like documenting, like my dad used to get so mad when we would take pictures like ducks and stuff. Like, at least get a person in there, like don't waste an actual film photo on a duck. But it was like all the duck photos that we got. So this was like a photo, it may have even been a slide, because some of my aunts had like digitized some of the old slides. Somewhere it existed.
Yeah.
And I was able to see it again. And so yeah, I don't even remember who that was on the TV, but it was somebody who was wearing like a military uniform, so it might have been like the news. But yeah, so the toys are in there, and then there were books. We had the encyclopedias up at the top. I didn't draw them all, but we had, you know, somebody came through selling encyclopedias and we bought them. And they were there. And I mean, we needed it because we didn't have the internet, so we had to look up stuff. So everything was there. There was a record player, and so that space was, you know, it was kind of a hub of the house. And so when I saw that, I thought it might be a good thing to document with one of my 2. I was able to do 2 pieces that size, and I just needed. well, it was also kind of like a maximalist image, which I thought would, yeah. But yeah, so I have fond memories of that space, and I don't know, like the paper pulp lets it be, it can be loose, it can be abstract and figurative at the same time. It's just, the paper is so versatile.
Yeah.
It really is a magic material.
How did the two of you decide on your colors?
You wanna do this?
The colors are also so much part of the works and very vibrant in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question for me because I'm a color material specialist in
Oh,
some
yeah.
sense, and so it's like, I mean, a lot of it is predetermined, it's a natural color palette. But I have been integrating papers that are synthetically dyed. But for the most part, almost everything you see is a naturally derived color.
Wow.
I'm looking around to see, not this black, and like some of the other blues are not naturally dyed, but a lot of the paper is. All of the yarn, all the string that you see is naturally dyed, and then anything where there's pigment or paint added is a natural pigment. So you don't have, you have like selective choices, but you're always gonna have this palette. And I think because I am drawn mostly to like earth pigments and earthy colors, that comes into it a lot. I mean, like for that piece, for example, I knew because of the title, I wanted it to sort of feel like you were receding into the earth. And so that like kind of like the external pieces, those dark brown, that's soil and earth pigment mixed in with fiber paste. And then there's rocks from 3 different parts of the world. There's rocks from Iceland, Los Angeles, and Mexico. And then the brown that's underneath that is black walnut ink that I made. Where did I get those from? Those might have been made here. No, that's black walnuts from, I think, Vermont. And so, so that's not, then those like kind of orangey halos around those kind of divots, that's earth pigment. So I don't know, I mean, again, like the color materials I use also have significance for where I'm applying them. So I think about whether or not it's gonna be like a plant-based ink or an earth pigment based off of like the meaning I'm trying to convey in the work.
But what comes first? Like this series behind us, colors are all very different. Did you have to make the colors in order to complete the vision that you had for it, or you already had all your pigments?
This is what's fun with paper, is that I think I start off with like an idea in mind of kind of what I want the image to be, but that always changes. But I like pull paper and kind of layer things on top of each other and work with yarn. This is what's been so fun for me, working with kind of more physical materials and not with just like a paint palette. Because before I was making all my own paint. And then a lot of those choices were, I mean, sometimes I was just making a painting because I had like leftover paint I made from something else, and I'm like, this is fine, we'll make this indigo, it's okay. But I guess it's, yeah, I mean, I think that's what's been so fun for me, and I get, it's like, you're limited in a certain sense based on what you have, but that's also kind of the magic about it too, is that you have to sort of make things work and piece things together. Like the puzzle piecing part of art making for me is one of the most exciting things.
Yeah, and what about you, Melissa? Are these colors true to your memories or to the photos?
They're a mix. When I work with the people at Dieu Donné for the colored base sheets, I get to pick the ones that are sort of the clear white color. That's the natural color of Abaca when it's just made into pulp. So yeah, before I would come in, they would ask me to send them swatches of the colors that I would want the base sheets to be. So I had picked. There are certain colors that are meaningful to me, like the color of like turmeric I use a lot, like sort of peaches. I use this yellow color, yeah, right there, it's turmeric. And then this like purple eggplant color I use too. So so they will match the pulp that they're mixing to the color.
It's really amazing.
It's really, they're really masters there. And it's kind of, I've done a few residencies now like that, where you get to work with people who are masters of something, and it's awesome to get to like fast forward or like sort of speed, like track yourself. Like I don't have time in one lifetime to become a master printmaker, a master ceramicist, a master stone carver. Like it's not possible. So these collaborations really create incredible opportunities for artists to be able to like have an access and like a little idea of what it might be like to work in those spaces. But in the beginning, they would have, I told them I would just take whatever pigment colors were left over from so they didn't have to mix any on purpose. And then as I got more comfortable, I would request certain colors, and they would make them.
Amazing. Let's talk about your stories yourselves as art educators and how that informs your practices, or maybe not, maybe they're totally divergent and or separate. But the two of you, both, I mean, you were an art teacher for how long?
10 years.
10 years.
Yeah.
And Julia, you're still teaching, you're still very actively. I mean, actually, Julia's doing a workshop at Mass Art at the end of February for a whole weekend, so look out for that information. Yeah, tell me about the art ed angle or histories and how that is kind of playing into your work right now as a practicing artist too.
Yeah, I can go first. I mean, I usually say that it just runs in tandem. And part of, we were talking about this last night actually, my mother-in-law and my best friend from college are both here and are both teachers, and we were talking about it last night about like the best thing about teaching and why it kind of, if you enjoy it, why it sort of never gets old is you learn as much from your students as they're hopefully maybe learning from you. And so I think I just learned so much from teaching that I kind of never want to stop, and sometimes I'm like, I'll want to teach about a subject or something, and I'm like, that I don't know anything about. It kind of gives me an incentive and a push to like do a deep dive into research for that. And so I think it's just like made me like a more kind of like fleshed out person, which has made my art practice expansive in turn. But
you generally teach teenagers?
I teach everybody. So I'm a museum educator, and I work at a bunch of different places. And if you're a museum educator in New York, you like, it's kind of like incestuous. Like you work at all these different places, everybody knows each
it's
other.
Like that here.
Yeah. And so I bounced around quite a bit, but I work with, I do a program with Dieu Art Foundation every spring with second graders. Pairs artist educators up with local schools. Right now I'm doing a teen program with the Yng-Ru Chen Museum, and I also teach workshops, independently. I teach an adult class at Swiss Institutes, and now I'm sorry, I don't mean to like just tell you my resume, but I love teaching all ages. I really do. I love working with young people. I love working with teenagers. It's probably my favorite. But I don't know. I mean, I think for me, it's just like I'm a learner, and I think being an educator, that's like the fun part of that job as well, is you get to learn with them.
Do you ever tell them what you're making in the studio, or is that very church and state for you?
It's so funny. It's like I was thinking about this talk today, and I was like, I'm feeling a little nervous. Like with teaching at this point, I don't really get nervous because I don't know. It's sometimes when you're meeting a new group or a new cohort of students, it can be a little nerve-wracking in the beginning when I get over it. But talking about my own work with my students is actually kind of hard for me, and it's hard for me to separate that out because I want to be like generous and give as much space for them and for their work, and I can kind of bring my own practice into it on occasion. But for the Gucci Museum, they asked me to do an artist talk for the teens, and I was like, I don't know. I kind of just want to like talk about them and other artists that they could connect to. And I did it, and I was really nervous. I was like, wow, like I haven't done an artist talk for my students, for young people, like maybe ever, in a really like, we're doing a 45-minute long artist talk kind of way. And they were into it, and it was really exciting, and I'm really glad I did it. But it is something I kind of shy away from, and I'm maybe thinking through now, I don't have to do that as much. Yeah.
It gives you some street cred with them too.
It does give you street cred, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, I guess when I was like in my early, I always like loved art, but I didn't know how to make it a career path. I didn't do a BFA, and I was searching and teaching. I had been working as a textile designer, and RISD had this like MAT degree where if you had an art, you could submit a portfolio and get your teaching degree, and it seemed like something that I might be able to do, because I had done like, I was like a Girl Scout counselor and like things like that, and I thought, well, maybe I can do this. But I was really nervous when I started teaching, because I'm not a performer. I tend to be like, I'm not making eye contact with people very much here right now, because and my students used to say that. They're like, what are you even looking at? I don't look at
My
you
kids are really real. Kids are so real, and that's something to learn.
So there is that, like, there was an intimidation factor, but it really is like one of the most rewarding, I think, professions there is. There's no question every day when you wake up, like, why am I doing this job? Who am I showing up for? Those questions are answered. The politics of it obviously are difficult everywhere, but the job itself, and if you're just thinking of the one-on-one with the students, it's so meaningful, even when it's hard. And even the students now, like even though I'm not teaching full-time now, a lot of my students have moved to New York and they'll like come to art shows, or they'll come, I'm in the process of making like a needle felting kit to give to one of my students who wants to try it. Who's like, he's 27 now, but he's in fashion and he thinks he wants to like do some felting. So it's a job that I think also is easy because it doesn't have like hard borders, which can be a challenge of the job when it's never over. But it's also a beautiful thing when the job and the life flow together so smoothly. And yeah, I think the same thing. Like I as an art teacher, you're problem solving all day long. Like the kids are trying to figure something out, and you help them figure it out. So I think it helped me figure out a lot of stuff. And I like, if you teach people and drill kids in composition and like the arts and like the principles and oh my gosh, I would be fired if I couldn't. I can't remember the word. Elements and principles of design. Like you learn them too.
Yeah.
You learn them pretty well when you're teaching them. So I think it really actually helped my own sort of understanding of, and I also taught art history, so that also really helped me kind of understand and contextualize like when I was ready to make the jump to be an artist, like where did I fit in and who was I in conversation with.
We're good. No, I just wanted, we had a really beautiful moment back in May during an opening for Duke Riley, who you both know, and an artist that we show. And Duke grew up in the Boston area, and he's in his 50s now. He just had a solo museum show at Brooklyn Museum. I mean, he's really amazing, big time. And his high school art teacher showed up. And Duke, who is hilarious and very sarcastic, just melted, and just he was actually very very emotional. But even more so was the teacher, who just couldn't believe that like something that he had done. You never know which student is going to become that person. So it was just a beautiful moment. So we have about 5 or 10 minutes. Does anyone have any questions, or do you guys have questions? Actually, I want to ask one more thing. For each of you, I feel like 2025, there's big stuff happening. Can you give a sentence or two, something that you're excited about in your practice or your careers that we should keep an eye out for?
I am working on a mural right now that will be part of the Brooklyn Museum Prize exhibition. So it's my first time doing anything this scale. I'm making the piece at 1/12 scale, so 5 feet, but it'll be 50 feet when it's like up on the wall. And I get to do. I've been like excited about the Siena Cathedral floor, so I'm sort of using that as like a design like structure format. So I'm just excited because I've been looking at the floor more. I'm starting to make. I took some time off at the end of last year from making just some personal family things, and then just being exhausted. So I'm just back in the studio and excited to continue the studio. But that's something that's coming up in June.
In June 2025, Brooklyn Museum, and it's the facade.
There'll be an installation on the facade of the Brooklyn Museum, and then on the side of the Wilco building in Bushwick.
Okay, great. Congrats. How about you, Julia?
I have let me think. So this year I have a group show that I'm in at Turley Gallery in Hudson in September. And then I have a solo show with Deanna Evans Projects in her new space in Tribeca in February, which is a year from now, which feels very far away but very close at the same time. And so, yeah, I mean, I have a very busy spring with teaching, so I'm excited to, carve out some pockets of time in the year to really focus on making that work. I really want to make work of that scale, so I told you all, that took me 5 months. So I have to, make some time for that, but
very excited for that.
Yeah.
Does anyone have questions? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much and congratulations. I have a question for Julia. What do you call your pieces? Are they paintings, wall pieces?
The question is, what does Julia call her painting? Like, how do you,
What are they? Sculptures?
sculpture, what kind of medium?
I'm gonna throw it back at you. What would you call them?
Difficult question, that's fine.
I feel the same way. Honestly, it's been really, really hard. I've had some conversations with people who are like, oh yes, these are paintings. I've had other conversations with people where they're sculptures, wall reliefs, assemblages, collages. I think it's like all of the above. I don't know. I mean, I'm like, that's the worst thing about like applications if you're an artist is you have to like,
Pick a box.
pick a box, exactly, and I don't, so the answer is I don't know. But I'm curious.
Yeah, we could take
what
a
other-
vote.
But other than like picking a box and doing it for an application, I honestly, it's art, it's my artwork. I don't really know. Yeah.
I just have a comment about that I think it's really wonderful that you can just make these items that refuse to fit in the old categories. And that, you encourage, you don't know what the name is. It's not this ism or that ism. So I congratulate you on that for having the courage.
Thank you.
Hey, I have a question about just in general, like for each of you, how you decide when an artwork is done, when a piece is done, because it seems like you're both kind of working in a different style, at least, or a new for Julia, and I don't know if the paper making and wet on wet was, I don't really know if it relates to your felt work, but it seems like there's like a nice contrast between the sort of extremely well cared for and layered pieces of Julia's and the very quick and like embedded material of the pulp painting.
Yeah.
And I guess also like yours feel very fast and like embedded, like I said.
Yeah.
And I guess I wonder if you are tempted. Did you decide that the piece, like you were going to go in and just finish the piece, and it was going to dry, and that was going to be it, or did you want to rework any afterwards, draw in, paint into them?
Yeah.
And then for Julia, like, how do you know when something is done? Because they're extremely, wrapped and like you were talking about wrapping paper around something. Like I see that on all these the edges, and there's embroidery, and there's like I feel like there's a quilt around the edges of these ones. And there you go.
So the question, in short, was how do you know when your work is done?
I think, the felt is very different. It's a lot more kind of tedious. Like, I think what I viewed this sort of whole process, and one of the things that was really nice about the opportunity to work with this material is, it was kind of the opposite. It's immediate, and it's urgent. And some days I would have to do 8 in one day, and then some days I would just do 1 in one day. So it just depended on the time that I was able to get. But I don't go back in. I sort of gave that to myself as a parameter that they'll be as finished as I can finish them in the space. Some people, you could theoretically go back in and work on them again, but if you get dry, there's this thing called papermaker's tears that I just learned about when I was doing the residency. So once paper dries, if water gets on it, it stains it permanently. And it's called a papermaker's tear, because you have water around, so it's like not uncommon to drip paper onto a dry piece of paper. And so I think like because of that, I kind of had this idea that I would try to keep them, kind of like encapsulated in the moment but it did put a lot of pressure. But what was nice was being able to have sometimes multiple to work on at once. So you could really push one really far, and if you do too much, then you just have to keep going until it brings itself back again. And then you also can kind of try to learn restraint. Like I think I had to try to do that too, and and I think it just practice. Like I probably made like 50 of them. They're not all here, but like some of them work better than others.
That should have been the title for the show, Papermaker's Tears. I love that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's so hard. Knowing when to stop is so hard. I I think it's a lot of just like practice. Like there's a lot of things in my studio that I shove in a corner or I tear things off of and reuse the panel because it just didn't work. Sometimes I think about it like Coco Chanel, like you take off the last thing that you put on before you leave the house. So I'll like be making something and I'll add something and I'll be like, okay, was that like one thing too many? And should I remove that? And now is it okay? Or sometimes I'll make something and it'll sit in my studio for a couple of months and I'm like not sure what to do to it, and then I figure it out and it's done. So yeah, I mean, as I kind of like play with new processes and learn new things and acquire more materials and paper, it's just like it's constantly evolving. It's one of the hardest things to do. But I think like I remember when my MFA, got my MFA in grad school, and I was writing something and I was struggling with it, and I had one professor say like the trick to writing and finishing or knowing when to stop is you just stop. And you just do it, and you make that choice. And sometimes you just have to do that and be like, you know what, it's as done as it's gonna be. And you know, and that's it. But sometimes it's like I'll still like in the gallery be touching things and arranging things and be like,
Yeah.
wanna make it perfect.
Yeah. Sometimes, yeah, I think being a good self-editor is a really hard job for an artist, and that's why there's a relationship with a curator or a gallerist or, you know, a critic. Is there another question? If not, I think we can wrap up. But, oh, Misha? Yeah.
I'm interested in the beyond Dieu Donné and the practice of casting paper, how you respond to the pairing of your work, because I think there's something really interesting that's coming out of these, of the combination of these pictorial narratives and these built constructions, and how seeing your work in this context, in this show, in conversation with one another, practice has given you, or whether that's given you a kind of new perspective on this body of work of your own.
I think so, for sure. I think, you know, we met before we came here, and I think we just have so much in common. And it's just a reminder that it's just another reminder, I think, that even abstract works say the same amount of things as figurative works somehow, right, about the person who's making them. And I think like we have so much in common that the works relate to each other, even though they're so different, because of all of the other things that we have in common. Like I think it makes them sort of show through, even just like formally, I think it's making me look at my work like from a formal like instead of from the story side of things. I'm looking at them when they're paired with these works. I'm thinking about them like that, and that's actually a nice way to like reframe, like to look at the work, because I'm so familiar with the stories that sometimes I think I forget, and so it's a nice way to kind of reconnect with them in that way. But also just like seeing, like I have a bunch of these little spiky guys in my studio, and I have a bunch of like found objects in my studio, and I can feel, I used to wrap things in fabric, and I have those in the studio, and so like I feel the connection between the things that we have in common. I can see it sort of happening in the work.
And I'll just add one quick thing to that, which is I was familiar with Melissa's work before we actually like hung out. And I think for me, like it's always just like the best thing ever when you really love someone's work and then you meet them and they're like also the nicest person. It just makes you like the work even that much more. But like yeah, we just like speak the same language, and we met, we feel like we've known each other forever. But I think because I knew of her work before, I was a fan of her work. But I love artists where you can see the hand. And again, that like ties back to like the act of care. But her work has like so much of her hand in it and so much of her energy in it, and I think I like very much so connect to that also. But yeah.
I'm so happy you're both here. Thanks for that question. And congratulations to you both.
Thanks for having us.
And I think we can close up. Thank you all for being here. We will have a reception now, but you can always come back to the gallery. The show closes on February 15th. And we're thrilled to have you both in Boston. I'm just really grateful. Thank you.